Get your garbage out of my way." The voice cut through the quiet hum of the courthouse corridor like a razor blade. Sterling Hayes didn't walk. He glided. A $5,000 Tom Ford suit, a Rolex Daytona that caught the fluorescent lights. He was 35 years old and had never lost a case he couldn't buy, bully, or blackmail his way out of. He kicked the wooden easel. The charcoal pencils scattered across the cold marble floor. Red, black, gray. They rolled until they hit the polished leather of Sterling's shoes. Elias Vance didn't flinch. He was 65 years old. He wore a faded gray cardigan that smelled like cheap drip coffee and old paper. The elbows were patched. His shoes had scuff marks from walking 3 miles from the bus stop every morning. Elias slowly knelt down. His joints popped in the quiet hallway. He began to gather the pencils, one by one. "I said," Sterling sneered, stepping closer so the toe of his shoe pinned a black pencil to the floor. "Get your garbage out of my way. You're a parasite." Elias didn't look up. He reached for the pencil. Sterling kicked it away. It snapped in half. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, old man." Elias stopped. He slowly raised his head. His eyes were calm, terrifyingly calm. Not a single muscle in his face twitched. "I am looking at you, Mr. Hayes," Elias said. His voice was barely a whisper. "I see exactly what you are." Sterling laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and let it flutter to the ground. "Buy yourself a new hobby and stay out of my courthouse." Sterling turned and walked away. His entourage of junior lawyers laughed nervously and followed. Elias picked up the broken pencil. He picked up the $100 bill. He didn't pocket it. He placed it precisely in the nearby trash can. Then he opened his thick, leather-bound sketchbook. He began to draw. What Sterling Hayes didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have comprehended in his arrogant, insulated world, was that he had just made the final, fatal mistake of his entire career. In exactly 14 days, that parasite was going to strip Sterling of his wealth, his license, and his freedom. And Sterling was going to do nothing but watch. I promise you this. By the end of this story, you are going to see a millionaire reduced to begging on his knees. But to understand how we got there, let me take you back. 2 weeks earlier. The courthouse smelled like lemon polish and desperation. For most people, it was a place of nightmares, a place where lives were ruined with the bang of a gavel. But for Elias Vance, it was just quiet. Every morning at exactly 8:15 a.m., Elias walked through the heavy oak doors of courtroom 302. He always sat in the back row. The wooden bench groaned slightly under his weight. He would open his sketchbook, uncap a black pen, and observe. People thought he was just a courtroom sketch artist, a freelancer, a lonely old man who had nothing better to do. He had $14 in his wallet. He packed a peanut butter sandwich in a brown paper bag every single day. He drove a 1998 Honda Civic with a dented passenger door. He was invisible, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Before she passed away, his wife used to tell him something, a phrase that became the anchor of his life. "The loudest man in the room is always the weakest, Elias. Watch the quiet ones." Elias watched. He watched the way prosecutors sweated when they lied. He watched the way defense attorneys tapped their pens when they were hiding evidence. He watched it all, and he drew it. Not just faces, angles, timestamps, the exact tilt of a head when perjury was committed. Then there was Sterling Hayes. Sterling was the loudest man in every room. He was the lead partner at Hayes and Croft, a corporate defense firm that specialized in burying the little guy. He represented chemical companies that dumped toxic waste. He defended billionaires who stole from their employees, and he never, ever fought fair. There were 14 active ethics complaints against Sterling Hayes. 14. But 0 had been acted on. Why? Because the head of the state disciplinary board was his uncle. Because he donated heavily to the judge's re-election campaigns. Because the system was rigged and Sterling held the remote control. On a rainy Tuesday, Sterling was defending a pharmaceutical CEO who had knowingly sold defective heart monitors. Elias sat in his usual spot in the back row, watching. The plaintiff was a young mother who had lost her husband. She was crying on the stand. Her hands trembled as she held up a picture of her family. Sterling stood up for cross-examination. He didn't ask her about the heart monitor. He asked her about her credit card debt. He asked her about a brief separation she and her husband had 5 years ago. He twisted her grief into a weapon. "Isn't it true," Sterling sneered, leaning heavily on the podium, "that you're just looking for a payday to cover your shopping habits?" The woman broke down completely. The judge, an old friend of Sterling's father, barely raised a hand to stop him. From the back row, Elias's pen scratched against the paper. He wasn't drawing the woman. He was drawing Sterling, the smirk on his face, the way he looked at the jury to see if his cruelty had landed. Elias wrote a timestamp in the corner of the page, 10:42 a.m., pattern of emotional abuse, violation of Rule 3.4. Sterling happened to glance toward the back of the room. He saw the old man in the frayed sweater looking at him, not looking at him with awe or fear, but with pity. Sterling hated pity. When the court recessed, Sterling marched out into the hallway. That was when the confrontation happened. The kicked easel, the snapped pencil, the $100 bill thrown on the ground. "Stay out of my courthouse," Sterling had said. Elias had remained completely silent, because Elias knew something Sterling didn't. You don't warn a building before you demolish it. You just plant the explosives. And the explosives were already ticking. Sterling Hayes stepped into the back of his chauffeured Mercedes. He poured himself a glass of scotch from the minibar. He was annoyed, not angry, just annoyed, like a mosquito buzzing near his ear. That old man, Elias, the way he hadn't flinched, the way he had looked at him. "Call Marcus," Sterling told his assistant. "Tell him I don't want to see that vagrant artist anywhere near the 3rd floor ever again." Marcus was the head bailiff at the courthouse. He also happened to owe Sterling a lot of money from a bad gambling debt, a debt Sterling casually reminded him of every few months. The very next morning, at 8:15 a.m., Elias arrived at the courthouse. He walked through the metal detectors. He took the elevator to the 3rd floor, just like he had done for the last 2 years. But Marcus was waiting by the heavy oak doors of courtroom 302. "Sorry, Elias," Marcus said, crossing his arms. He wouldn't make eye contact. New fire code regulations. No loitering in the gallery unless you're a documented member of the press. Elias looked at Marcus. Then he looked past him through the glass window of the courtroom door. Sterling was inside, sitting at the defense table. Sterling turned around, saw Elias, and offered a slow, mocking wave. Elias didn't wave back. "I understand," Elias said softly. "Have a good day, Marcus." Elias turned around and walked back to the elevator. Sterling chuckled to himself. He thought he had won. He thought he had swatted the mosquito. But what Sterling didn't know was that Elias didn't need the 3rd floor. He didn't need to be inside the courtroom to see the rot. The rot always leaked out into the hallway. Elias went down to the main lobby. He sat on a hard wooden bench near the elevators, and he opened his sketchbook. He drew the bailiff, accepting a thick envelope from one of Sterling's junior partners. He drew the judge entering a private stairwell with Sterling right before the verdict was announced. He documented it all. But Sterling wasn't finished. Men like Sterling never stopped at just inconveniencing someone. They had to destroy them. It was a sport. Sterling hired a private investigator to look into the old man. It didn't take long to find the one thing Elias loved more than anything else in the world: his daughter, Clara. Clara was 32. She ran a small, struggling florist shop on the edge of town. She worked 14-hour days, waking up at 4 a.m. to go to the flower markets. She was barely scraping by, trying to save money for her own daughter's college fund. On a Thursday afternoon, a man in a sharp suit walked into Clara's shop. He didn't buy anything. He handed her a thick manila envelope and walked out. Clara opened it. Her heart dropped into her stomach. It was a lawsuit filed by Hayes and Croft. They were representing a massive national floral chain. The lawsuit claimed that Clara's shop logo euros, a simple hand-drawn Daisy-A euros, was an egregious trademark infringement on their corporate brand. It was a blatant lie, a fabricated, malicious lie, but the truth didn't matter in civil court. What mattered was who could afford to fight. The lawsuit demanded $200,000 in immediate damages. Clara collapsed into a chair behind the counter. She couldn't breathe. $200,000. She didn't even have $2,000 in her savings account. That evening, Clara went to her father's small apartment. She was crying so hard she could barely speak. "Dad," she sobbed, handing him the papers, "I'm going to lose the shop. I'm going to lose everything." Elias took the papers. He put on his reading glasses. He read through the dense legal jargon. He saw Sterling Hayes' signature at the bottom of the page. Bold. Arrogant. Elias's jaw locked. His knuckles went white as he gripped the paper. "It's going to be fine, Clara," Elias said. His voice was steady, like a rock in a storm. "You won't lose anything." "How can you say that?" Clara cried. "They're a massive law firm. We have nothing." Elias hugged his daughter. He patted her back. "Just give me 2 more days," he whispered. The next morning, Elias took the bus downtown. He didn't go to the lobby. He went straight to the clerk's office on the first floor. He carried a single hand-typed motion to dismiss the lawsuit. He filed it pro se euros, meaning he was representing himself. The clerk at the desk, a young man named Kevin, took the paperwork. He stamped it. "I'll get this to the judge's docket, sir," Kevin said. But Kevin didn't put it in the docket file. 10 minutes later, Kevin picked up his phone. He dialed a private number. "Mr. Hayes?" Kevin whispered, looking around nervously. He filed a motion to dismiss. "Put it in the shredder, Kevin." Sterling's voice came through the speaker. "Or I'll make sure that DUI from last year suddenly becomes public knowledge." Kevin swallowed hard. He took Elias's hand-typed motion. He walked over to the industrial shredder in the corner of the office. The machine roared to life. The paper disappeared into ribbons. Sterling Hayes sat in his penthouse office, looking out at the city skyline. He smiled. He loved the sound of crushing someone. But the escalation wasn't over. By Friday, the local wholesale flower suppliers suddenly stopped taking Clara's orders. When she called them, they were evasive. "I'm sorry, Clara," one supplier finally admitted over the phone. "Hayes and Croft sent us a letter. They said if we do business with you, they'll name us as co-defendants in the lawsuit. We can't afford that kind of heat." Sterling had systematically cut off her supply line. He was starving her out. At 3 p.m. that afternoon, a courier arrived at Elias's apartment. He handed Elias a thick, cream-colored envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, an invitation from Sterling Hayes. "Come to my office, 5 p.m. Let's end this." Elias arrived at the Hayes and Croft building at exactly 4:55 p.m. The lobby was lined with imported Italian marble. The security guard sneered at his scuffed shoes. He was escorted to the top floor. Sterling's office was massive. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows offering a $10 million view of the city. Sterling sat behind a desk made of reclaimed mahogany. He didn't stand up when Elias walked in. "Take a seat, old man," Sterling said, gesturing to a leather chair. Elias didn't sit. He stood perfectly still. Sterling sighed, leaning back in his chair. He tossed a document onto the desk. "Here is the deal," Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You sign this paper. It's a public apology. You admit that you're a nuisance, a liar, and a trespasser. You agree to never step foot within a 1-mile radius of the courthouse." Sterling leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "And your daughter signs over the lease of her pathetic little flower shop to my client. You do that, and I drop the $200,000 lawsuit. You don't, and I will take the shop, I will take her house, and I will make sure she spends the next 10 years drowning in legal debt." Silence. 5 seconds. 10. Elias looked at the document on the desk. Then he looked at Sterling. "You are a very confident man, Mr. Hayes," Elias said quietly. "I'm a winner," Sterling snapped. "Sign the damn paper." Elias slowly reached into his pocket. He pulled out a cheap plastic pen. He leaned over the mahogany desk. He signed the document. Sterling's smirk returned, a wide, victorious grin. He snatched the paper away. "Good boy," Sterling sneered. "Now get out of my sight." Elias turned and walked toward the heavy glass door. He didn't look back. But what Sterling didn't know, what he couldn't possibly fathom, was that Elias Vance wasn't surrendering. That that signature wasn't a white flag. It was a receipt. The trap was now fully, perfectly set, and the countdown to Sterling's destruction had just hit 0. The following Monday, the mahogany doors of the State Bar Association boardroom swung open. Sterling Hayes walked in. He didn't just walk, he owned the room. He was wearing a brand new bespoke suit. He smiled and shook hands with the men sitting around the massive oval table. These were the power brokers of the city, the elite. Sterling wasn't there because he was in trouble. He was there for his final ethics revuo, euros, a mere formality, before he was officially named senior partner at Hayes and Croft. Sitting at the head of the table was Judge Harrison Croft, Sterling's uncle. "Sterling, my boy," Harrison smiled warmly. "Take a seat. This shouldn't take more than 15 minutes. Just a standard review of your record." Sterling sat down. He adjusted his Rolex. "Of course, Uncle Harrison. I'm an open book." "There is just one minor administrative change," Harrison said, clearing his throat. "The Supreme Court recently instituted a new oversight protocol for senior partner elevations in our district. We have a special guest investigator who will be leading the panel today." Sterling frowned slightly. "A guest investigator? From where?" Before Harrison could answer, the heavy side door of the boardroom clicked open. The room fell dead silent. A man walked in. He wasn't wearing a frayed gray cardigan. He wasn't wearing scuffed loafers. He was wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, and draped over his arm was the heavy, unmistakable black silk of a federal judicial robe. He walked to the center chair at the head of the table. the chair reserved for the highest authority in the room. He sat down. Sterling froze. The blood instantly drained from his face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. It was Elias. Elias didn't smile. He didn't gloat. His face was carved out of granite. He placed a thick, leather-bound sketchbook on the mahogany table. What is this?" Sterling stammered, his confident facade shattering in an instant. "Uncle Harrison, what is he doing here? He's a vagrant. He's a sketch artist from the lobby." Judge Harrison looked terrified. He wouldn't make eye contact with Sterling. "Mr. Hayes," Elias said. His voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was the voice of a man who had handed down life sentences. It commanded the air in the room. "Sit down." Sterling's legs gave out. He collapsed heavily into his chair. "Let's begin," Elias said. He opened the sketchbook. Layer 1. "This isn't a sketchbook, Mr. Hayes," Elias said, turning to the first page. "It's a ledger." Elias slid a page across the table. It wasn't a drawing of a face. It was a meticulously detailed shorthand transcript. October 14th, Elias read. "You directed your head bailiff, Marcus, to physically bar a citizen from a public courthouse to serve your personal vendetta. That is a federal civil rights violation. I have the audio recording of Marcus confessing to this arrangement yesterday afternoon." Sterling swallowed hard. That's hearsay." Layer 2. Elias turned the page. He slid a plastic evidence bag across the table. Inside were ribbons of shredded paper. "October 18th, Elias continued, his voice cold and relentless. "You ordered a court clerk named Kevin to destroy a pro se legal filing, a federal offense. Obstruction of justice. Kevin surrendered to the FBI this morning and provided his phone records. Your call to him lasted 42 seconds. Sterling's hands began to shake. He looked around the room. The other power brokers were staring at him with horror. Not because of what he had done, but because they were in the blast radius. Layer 3, the kill shot. Elias pulled out the signed apology letter, the receipt. And finally, Elias said, leaning forward, "You filed a fraudulent lawsuit against a small business owner named Clara Vance. You demanded $200,000 for a fabricated trademark infringement, and then you used the threat of that lawsuit to extort a signature from me." Elias paused. The silence in the room was suffocating. "You filed those fraudulent documents using the United States Postal Service, Mr. Hayes, across state lines to their corporate headquarters. That elevates this from a local grievance to federal wire fraud and extortion." Sterling's body language completely collapsed. His shoulders slumped. His jaw hung loose. His perfect posture was gone. He looked like a deflated balloon. "You!" Sterling stammered, his voice cracking. "You're just an old man. You draw pictures. Who do you think you are?" Elias stood up. He picked up his black robe and slid his arms into the sleeves. He zipped it up. The transformation was absolute. "I am Senior Federal Appellate Judge Elias Vance," he said, looking down at the broken millionaire. "I was appointed by the Supreme Court of the United States to conduct a covert investigation into judicial corruption in this district." Elias closed the sketchbook. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "And you, Mr. Hayes, have provided me with a masterpiece." "Uncle Harrison!" Sterling shouted, his voice cracking with pure panic. He turned to the man who had protected him his entire life. "Do something! Tell him he can't do this!" Judge Harrison Croft looked at his nephew. Then, very slowly, he slid his chair back from the table. "I can't help you, Sterling," Harrison whispered, his face pale. Elias Vance turned his cold gaze to Harrison. "No, you can't, Judge Croft. Because page 42 of this ledger details the kickbacks you received from Sterling's corporate clients. Your resignation will be expected on my desk by 5 p.m. today, or you will be indicted alongside him. Harrison didn't argue. He just nodded, completely defeated. The cascading consequences had begun. Elias looked back at Sterling. Sterling Hayes, effective immediately, your license to practice law in this state is permanently revoked. Sterling gasped. It sounded like he was drowning. But we aren't finished, Elias continued. Elias pressed a button on the conference table phone. You can come in now. The heavy mahogany doors opened again. 3 men in dark windbreakers walked into the boardroom. The yellow letters on their jackets read, FBI. Sterling Hayes, the lead agent said, pulling out a pair of steel handcuffs. You are under arrest for extortion, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. No, Sterling screamed. He scrambled backward, his $5,000 suit bunching up as he hit the wall. You can't do this. I'm a partner at this firm. I have money. I have power. The agents grabbed him. They slammed him face first onto the mahogany table. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked loudly around his wrists. You have the right to remain silent, the agent read. Sterling wasn't silent. He was sobbing. A millionaire, a man who had crushed hundreds of innocent people for sport, was weeping like a child as he was dragged out of the boardroom. The firm's senior partners didn't try to stop it. In fact, within 20 minutes of Sterling's arrest, Hayes and Croft issued a public statement terminating his employment and freezing his assets to cooperate with the federal investigation. They threw him to the wolves to save themselves. The news went viral instantly. A video of Sterling being frog-marched out of his own building in handcuffs, sobbing uncontrollably, hit 2 million views by nightfall. The empire he had built on cruelty had burned to the ground in less than an hour. 3 months later. The air was crisp and clear. The courthouse was busy, bustling with lawyers and clients. But things had changed. Sterling Hayes had pleaded guilty to avoid a federal trial. He was sentenced to 12 years in a minimum security prison. Every cent of his wealth was seized to pay restitution to the victims he had defrauded. One of those victims was a small florist shop on the edge of town. To avoid a massive federal lawsuit, the corporate board of Hayes and Croft had agreed to a private settlement with Clara Vance. $2 million. Clara didn't just save her shop. She bought the entire building. She hired 5 new employees. Her daughter's college fund was fully secured. On a quiet Tuesday morning, the heavy oak doors of courtroom 302 opened. A man walked in. He was wearing a faded gray cardigan with patched elbows. He walked to the back row and sat down on the wooden bench. It groaned slightly under his weight. Elias Vance unzipped his worn leather bag. He pulled out a brand new sketchbook. He uncapped a black pen. A young, aggressive prosecutor was yelling at a witness on the stand, trying to bully a confession out of a terrified teenager. Elias's pen began to scratch against the paper. He watched the prosecutor, the arrogant tilt of his head, the cruel smirk. Elias smiled softly. He wrote down the timestamp. Power is a dangerous drug. It makes people deaf to the quiet warnings around them. It makes them blind to the truth standing right in front of them. Sterling Hayes thought he was invincible because he was the loudest man in the room. He thought a frayed sweater and a quiet demeanor meant weakness. He was wrong. The loudest man in the room is always the weakest, and true justice doesn't scream. It watches, it waits, and when the time is exactly right, it strikes. Elias turned to a fresh page and kept drawing.